Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we welcome back a special guest, Mike Goldstein, Managing Director of the Center for Higher Education Transformation at Tyton Partners. Mike is a pioneer in the development of the legal environment in higher education and a counselor at the highest levels of legislation. Mike founded the law firm Dow Loans in 1978, which merged into Cooley in 2014, and he was a senior partner at Cooley for 7 years before moving on to Tyton a couple of years ago. Mike joins us today to discuss the changing face of higher education mergers and partnerships, and how Tyton and other visionaries are looking outside of higher ed for potential partners. Mike, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you. Drumm, it's truly a pleasure to be here.
And likewise, sir, it's always great to have you on the show. You have such great insights on what's going on in the higher ed industry, and let's get to it. Lots of interesting things, especially in the areas of partnerships.
Oh, absolutely. I think what is happening increasingly is that especially smaller institutions, and not limited to that, are beginning to realize that the economics of higher education, the economics of maintaining a campus, all the things that are needed to do an effective job for students are outstripping the capacity of institutions to generate sufficient revenue, whether it's earned or contributed or comes out of grants. And a lot of folks are looking for alternatives. The first instinct is, well, let's see if we can merge with someone. If there's someone out there with a big lifeguard T-shirt that can come along and pull us out of the water. And I think what we're beginning to see is some broader thinking about not necessarily continuing to go it alone, but looking at what are the options for collaborating, for partnering with entities that may not look at all like the institution itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, it makes a lot of sense because, as we've talked before, typically when you're looking for a merger partner, you unfortunately you look for somebody who's like you. And many times that has to do with the finances aren't good. And, a 1 + 1 in this case doesn't even make it close to 2.
I think that's obviously a chief problem, that two struggling institutions combining typically result in one struggling institution that's struggling even worse. But the question is not so much, we're not necessarily looking for another institution that is much stronger or much larger. And of course, the risk there is getting swallowed up and losing one's identity, which has to be very carefully curated to avoid that to the extent that one needs to and wants to. But it's whether that is the way to best leverage what an institution does and can do, and where 1 + 1 can in fact equal 3. And there have been some interesting examples. A recent one is Paul Smith's College, upstate New York, which is a very well-regarded, small, independent institution. It is in the process of merging with a larger institution, but it's not an institution. What it's looking to merge with is an organization, a social welfare organization that, among other things, provides training and other services to the community. And the theory behind this is the opportunity that the larger organization will be able to take advantage of the unique skills and capabilities that are being provided through Paul Smith's, and that Paul Smith's will be able to take advantage of the much larger back office capabilities, whether it's resources, financial management, management of operations, that the social welfare organization has. So it's looking to create a partnership of dissimilar entities that then capitalize on each other's strengths and not accelerate existing weaknesses.
Well, that sounds to me similar to the Dream Center and what they had wanted to do previously.
That's a really interesting model. Dream Center Foundation is a social welfare organization with religious foundations, but very broad in its work. That started in Los Angeles, that has become an organization with affiliates throughout the United States. It does a very, very substantial amount of excellent community development work in early childhood and early grades education, in providing food banks, and also in providing employment services and, to a limited extent, workforce training. An opportunity arose that would have enabled the Dream Center Foundation to acquire a large post-secondary institution in the workforce training domain. Quite large national footprint, campuses all over the country. And this was seen as a way to take a relatively limited ability to influence how one educates a workforce in communities that desperately need that, and leverage that with the credibility, with the skills, with the special competencies that the Dream Center Foundation had. Now, it didn't work out for reasons that were, I think, quite extrinsic to the idea. But I think the idea itself has legs. It's not so much a question of looking for what is like the institution. It's looking for something that, I guess the analogy would be, what can one attach to, end-to-end attachment that pulls the institution along and that might pull along the other organization, and where the cultures, where the purposes are not necessarily the same, but they are not so dissimilar that you can't make them work. So it's taking the horizon that we all use, which is, who out there looks a lot like us, and go to who out there is doing things that might be complementary, not the same as, but complementary to that which we do.
Well, that's not a unheard of concept. It's somewhat different in higher education, but we see this with med schools, hospitals establishing nursing schools, things along this line. More frequency in medicine.
I think we see it in a lot of fields. In business generally, it's called vertical integration. You acquire companies that are your suppliers. You acquire companies that are in a related field. You acquire companies where the customer bases may be similar, even though you're providing different products. It's not at all uncommon in business. It's just that in higher education, we've grown up with tunnel vision. We've grown up with the notion that we are so unique that we really can't function effectively with other kinds of enterprises. And I'm not talking now about throwing oneself into the for-profit world. I'm talking about working with other nonprofit or governmental or for-profit entities. This has nothing to do with the financial structure. It has everything to do with what is the organization doing and how does what it does potentially complement what the institution can do and vice versa.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you look at something from a vertical integration and a synergistic perspective. You'll see businesses looking to buy suppliers, buy the outlets for their distribution of their products. Higher ed has never looked at anything like this before. It's always been a standalone, we can do it all. And of course, there hasn't been a lot of conversation with the user of the end product, the employers, to find out what they need. And this sounds like, from a workforce development perspective, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, we've seen that sector become inhabited by some new companies, new entrants. Guild is a very good example. Kale has been doing this for a very long time, providing mechanisms for employers to contract with a single source to facilitate their employees using their education benefits to maximum advantage. And of course, the value here is that you have a single purpose enterprise. InStride is another example that has become expert in working with employers to customize the experience for their employees so that they have the maximum opportunity to select the right educational program at the right institution, the management of their employment benefits. Now, these are our third-party providers. And one of the questions is, why haven't institutions done this themselves? And the answer is they've done some of it. But again, you have this issue of, can you take some of these enterprises and can you attach them end to end to institutions so that you have a much more intimate, much more free-flowing exchange between employers and institutions? And again, it's a question of standing on a high enough rock and looking at what's out there and not averting your gaze from something that doesn't look like you. Part of the problem has been this instinct that if we step outside of our zone of comfort, the regulators are going to whack us. For a long time, that was not entirely inaccurate. There was the same tunnel vision in the regulatory side, and I have to say, unfortunately, significantly so with the accreditors, because the people who do the accreditation are people from institutions. They have the same limited peripheral vision, if you will.
Sure.
They're very comfortable with evaluating what they know, and they're much less comfortable evaluating what they don't know. To the enormous credit of the accrediting community, there has been a tremendous broadening in perspective, a very substantial willingness to look at new institutional models, new ways of constructing institutions, and new kinds of alliances that would be appropriate for institutions. The other thing that's helped here is, for a very long time, the Department of Education very tightly constrained the accreditors in what they could do, and particularly with the regional accreditors, saying that they could only function within their regions. Now, for one thing, that kept accreditors kind of tightly constrained. It also reduced competition.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the good things that came out of the Trump administration from the Department of Education was a loosening of those rules so that the regional accreditors are no longer regional. They are institutional accreditors. They can accredit anywhere. And there was a fear that this would create a race to the bottom, that everybody would try to make their rules lighter and lighter so that more and more institutions would flock to them. I think it's actually gone the other way. I think there's, in a sense, a race to the top, because several of the accreditors have made it very clear that they are welcoming innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Don't come to us with bad quality. Don't come to us with problems, but come to us with new ideas. And if we haven't done it, we'll look at it. And so you now have several of the major accreditors, the Western Association, the Higher Learning Commission, the New England Commission in particular, that have become very open to looking at new ideas, to developing ways to assess quality and institutional integrity in settings which just didn't exist in the past. And what that's doing in turn is encouraging institutions to say, well, we always thought they'd laugh at us if we came with that idea, and now we're realizing they're inviting us in. And so it is competition, but it's, I think in a very real way, it's a race to the top.
I would have to agree with you. I am seeing more and more of the accreditors inviting innovation coming through. And this is important. This is important for higher ed. It's important for the accreditors.
I think it's absolutely essential. I don't think that many of the major industries that we have would exist if we did not have that encouragement of innovation. And while the accreditors will vehemently dispute that they've inhibited innovation, I mean, if you talk to institutions, you talk to faculty, you talk to institutional leaders, they will almost uniformly say, well, yeah, it was a great idea, but we didn't think the accreditor would buy it. And I think that that is significantly changing, and that there is a willingness now on the part of the accreditors not to say anything goes, but to listen to what might sound to be a harebrained idea and what might in fact be a harebrained idea, which then they should be informed accordingly, but might in fact be the next big thing.
But if they're relating it back to, and I realize we're getting a little bit off track from the partnership model, but that's okay.
Well, I don't think we are. I don't think we are, because
Okay.
one of the things that the accreditors were very clear with was that if you're going to partner, you've got to show that you've got a kind of there's a natural affinity.
Right.
That this it naturally you're building you're putting together jigsaw pieces, and the pieces have to fit. And that definition of have to fit constrained what you could look at.
Yes, I agree. The innovation piece is critical, and they're looking for more innovation. You know, when I talk to potential clients about different accreditors and their strengths and the areas for improvement, what I typically say is you have two sides of a scale. One is about compliance, and the other side is about innovation. The innovation doesn't mean that you don't meet standards. There is a baseline for standards, but they want to see innovation and continuous improvement as they go along. Does this make sense to you?
Yes, it makes absolute sense. But remember, what the accreditors typically looked for was the notion that the leadership of the acquiring institution, that the nature of the acquiring institution, was compatible with the idea of leading, of controlling an accredited post-secondary institution. And that created a very small box.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's occurring now is a willingness to say, all right, you may be acquired by something that looks completely different, social welfare organization. And it's not an institution. But I think there's a willingness now to look at how that organization is organized, what its leadership is like, what its board is like. Do they sufficiently understand what you need to do to be an accredited institution? Not necessarily have they lived in that same domain. And in the past, we tended to look at that and say, no, that's not going to work. I think that's changed.
And that's a good thing. That's a good thing for higher ed. It's a good thing for industry. If we start looking at it from the perspective of student outcomes, you're able to, with a partnership like this, you're able to change what you mean by who your student is. And it can get into more of the workforce development.
Well, it's not only workforce. I mean, an organization may simply see that part of its mission is education, and that by partnering with, acquiring, merging with a post-secondary institution, they can enhance that mission. So it may not be as, I won't use the word crass, but it may not be as limited as, well, we have a mission of workforce. It may be this is an extension of our mission into higher education. And we have the resources to support that, and we have an opportunity to acquire, to merge with an institution that needs our support and is doing a good job as an educational institution. And we think that's consistent with our social mission.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't have to be we need to get into the workforce business. It's that there's an opportunity for us to do something greater than what we're currently doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be unrelated, but it's still important.
Yeah, which makes sense. So looking at it from the investment banking side, you're with Tyton Partners and you look at these type of things. When you're looking for a potential partner for an institution, what are some of the things that you look at?
Well, I think that's a really important question, because it's relatively easy to say, let's do a scan of what looks the same. Let's go to the iPad's data. Let's pull up institutions that have the same or similar characteristics, and that's going to be our list. And what we're doing now in terms of, and this is through our Center for Higher Education Transformation, is to look at what characteristics does an institution have that might be opportune for different kinds of enterprises, that where could there be an interest in relating to adapting what this institution does to something that is quite different. It's really an issue of finding a much higher rock to stand on and a really good set of binoculars. It's not just looking domestically. This is becoming a global marketplace. And so it is really a question of essentially not turning anything down at the threshold. Have the broadest perspective of what is in the possible, and then have an intelligent filtering process to bring down to what may work. And we have working on numbers of projects where the potential partners are in key respects very different from what we would have expected in the beginning. But because we were looking with a much wider field of view, we've been able to capture a greater degree of opportunities. And that creates more opportunity for the institutions. It creates a more competitive set of opportunities for the institution, whether we're on the acquiring side or the other side. A lot of the projects we do are working with institutions that are looking to enhance what they're doing and how they're serving their communities, broadly defined. And we're not looking in a narrow slice. We're looking very broadly to see, all right, what is out there that could be brought into the ambit of the institution.
Mm-hmm. So without giving away the secret sauce, how do you go about this type of thing?
I don't think there is a secret sauce. I think if there is, it's having some really smart folks who are really good analysts who know how to go through data. It's having an imagination. It's really wiping away the notion of if it doesn't say college or university, we're not going to look at it. If it doesn't say, if it's not located in the US, we're not looking at it. If it's not accredited, we're not going to look at it. It's being willing to look beyond and then have the imagination to think, how do you make that work? You're not creating a list. The issue is from that list, looking at what might work and then figuring out how to make it work. And it's sort of inverting the process. Because the traditional process is look for what works and then try to bring it in. And what we're saying, well, that's fine. Look for what works. That's the low-hanging fruit. But look for other things and then figure out how to make it work. And there are a lot of different ways to do that. There are public-private partnerships. There are ways to put together a nonprofit and a for-profit entity. There are ways to put together a public and a nonprofit entity. So again, it's not being constrained in looking for the right mechanisms.
And I think that's an important point to talk about is in the past, you would never see, or very rarely would you see a for-profit and a nonprofit merging. That's not the case. You've got the legal mechanisms, you've got the expertise to be able to deal with that. It seems like it's more of what is the market opportunity, and that requires, like you say, a higher rock to stand on.
And what we're also seeing, and this is quite an interesting phenomenon, because the for-profit institutions, other than those that are in pure workforce training, are struggling. There are some that are doing extremely well. They're very high-quality institutions. Strayer University, Capella, which are related institutions, have kind of been standing above the fray. And there are others similarly situated. But a lot of institutions have struggled. And the private equity market has essentially walked away from those institutions as appropriate investment targets for a variety of reasons, largely what they view as regulatory risk. Well, into that gap have flowed public and private institutions that see these enterprises as additive to what they do. And there is an active market now of public by public, and that is state institutions, and private, and by that I mean independent nonprofit institutions, that are acquiring for-profit institutions and typically converting them to nonprofit, but sometimes keeping them as for-profit. And there is a set of financing mechanisms extrinsic to the institutions that enable this, because you start with saying, okay, we have a for-profit enterprise institution, and the current owners, private equity or whatever, are looking for X times their net revenue. And you think of a nonprofit or a public writing a check that has a lot of zeros, and you shake your head and say, that ain't going to happen. It can happen because there are large financial institutions that are prepared to look at these transactions, and if the institution to be acquired has good financials and is generating good revenue, and it has good outcomes, it's working effectively as an institution, and it is producing graduates who persist in the program and do well on graduation, they're willing to create financing mechanisms that make this feasible for an institution that can't write a check. And it doesn't, by the way, mean it's a small institution. A public university typically can't write a 7, 8-digit, 9-digit check, even though it may have billions of dollars. So the financing is the whole perspective of what can one do in this public-private partnership arrangement is enormously different from what it was just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. That, I think, is probably going to be the subject for another podcast, how the financing and the public-private partnerships, because I'm thinking about a whole lot of different things, especially around the area of research, tech transfer, that these type of things would work well.
Absolutely.
Mike, we're coming up to the end of our time. It always seems to go fast. 3 takeaways for university presidents who might be thinking about this type of transaction.
Well, number one is think broadly, take off the blinders, get a good set of wide-angle binoculars. That would be number one. Number two, understand the value proposition of your institution. Not what your problems are, but what are your strengths. And number three, find folks to work with who understand not just your ecosystem, but the ecosystems that surround you, and that would enable you to take advantage of the opportunities, and then configure an arrangement that would make those opportunities work.
Those are great takeaways. Thank you. So what's next for you? What's next for Tyton?
Well, we're very actively working in this arena. We've been very pleasantly surprised at the depth of interest among institutions. Our interest is in institutional transformation, and I know that consistent with the work, Drumm, that you do, that doesn't just mean survival. That means institutions getting better and stronger. And we're all working in the same arena. And the goal is to enhance the post-secondary environment, make opportunities faster, better, cheaper for students. That requires innovation, it requires collaboration, and it requires imagination.
And that's something that you guys have in an abundance.
And I must say, we share that territory.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Mike, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. Until next time, my friend.
It is a pleasure, and I do look forward to our next opportunity.
Take care. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Mike Goldstein of Tyton Partners, and for his sharing his views on how higher ed institutions can look outside of higher ed to find new partners and potential new markets. Always a pleasure, Mike. Our next guest is Brandon Bustede, Golden Head of Learn Work Innovation at Kaplan and President of Kaplan University Partners. Brandon has a distinguished career in higher ed, and he'll be joining us to talk about how online education is coming of age and what your institution should be thinking about and doing to improve on its effectiveness and efficacy.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.